Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And we are once again very fortunate to have as our guest Scott Ritter, who obviously needs no introduction to the Gagglers. So let's get right into it. Scott, you wrote a very interesting article for Consortium News the other day. I won't even try to summarize it because the argument was very complex. I think you presented that there were three phases of the Russian operation since February the 24th. The first phase was the sort of rapid maneuver when they did a feint, pretended that they were interested in taking Kiev, but the purpose was just simply to tie down Kiev's forces in the west and unable to reinforce their troops in the Donbass. Then that phase came to an end at the end of March, when they withdrew from around Kiev and decided to focus on retaking the Donbass. And that's been this sort of war of attrition, which has gone on somewhat inconclusively for quite a while, well, obviously since the end of March. And then now we're into phase three, which is essentially Russia versus NATO. It's no longer Russia versus Ukraine, it's now Russia versus NATO. And I was now also thinking about this appearance that you made in May with Garland Nixon and
Ray McGovern.
Yes, Ray McGovern, for which you got a lot of flack. A lot of people criticized you, and you said in that debate that Russia will have to change its strategy because what it's doing isn't working. Essentially, that the United States, by pouring in as much weaponry and money as it has altered the game. And that if Russia intends to win, then, and I think you said, at the very least, it's going to have to mobilize. Well, I guess the events of the past week would tend to vindicate you, the judgment that you then made, for which you got a lot of flack. So do you feel vindicated, Scott?
Well, you know, I always hate using the term vindicated in a condition like this, because in order for me to be right, it's not that somebody else had to be wrong, people had to die. And it's the same way I feel about weapons of mass destruction. People are like, oh, do you feel vindicated? You got it right. No, I feel horrible, because if I had been able to present my argument, obviously I had the facts. There was something wrong with my argument, my presentation. I wasn't able to convince enough people. They believed the other side. We went to war. Thousands of Americans died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. How could I possibly have any satisfaction of being vindicated? Because it's not about me. I mean, if I'm the world's greatest narcissist, yeah, the second I'll transform, I feel very vindicated. It's all about me. No, it's not all about me. It's about the people on the ground. I'm just some idiot who sits in the background and does analysis. So on this one, look, when I made that statement to Garland and Ray, I knew I was right. I mean, I don't have a tendency, I'm as guilty of foot in the mouth disease as anybody else, but I try not to get too far ahead on analytical things, because that's my reputation at stake. I mean, that's what I do for a living. And before I met, I worked it out in my head. I mean, I do military math pretty good. I'm able to take a look at correlation of forces and go crunch, 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 crunch. They're probably going to win by this factor on this time scale. I've done that my entire life, and I've been right consistently. And I took a look at this and said, you can't pour $53 billion worth of military aid into a conflict like this in a short period of time without having some sort of meaningful impact. Now, the response to that is, yes, but Russia will be able to hit them with their missiles, interdict them coming in. Not if they start off with the security of depth that's provided by training on NATO soil. So when you open up NATO as your strategic depth, you now have the Ukrainians leaving, getting trained, and then we create a command and control center that's outside of Ukraine as well. So you can't interdict command and control, and I create an intelligence structure that's all NATO, and Russia can't interdict that. Now I realize we got a problem, because if they're able to get these troops into Ukraine, they're already organized, already equipped, they already have the complete support infrastructure. You've got a new reality, and it's one that Russia isn't prepared to deal with. Russia beat the Ukrainian army this summer. People need to understand that. The Ukrainian military that existed when the special military operation started was defeated this summer. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, dead and wounded, almost a complete eradication of the existing stocks, the tanks, the artillery, the support, wiped out. The Air Force wiped out. Wait a minute, Scott, they're flying MiG-29s. They ain't the original MiG-29s. They're ones brought in from NATO. They're flying Su-25s. Ain't the original Su-25s. They're flying HIPs, not the original HIPs. All that stuff's gone. It's been replaced by new equipment with new infrastructure. The tanks that are being used are Polish T-72s, former East German T-72s, Bulgarian equipment. The artillery is Czech, it's French, it's British, it's Norwegian, it's American. The Ukrainian army was defeated by the Russians. So understand this, the Russians, when they made their initial calculations about 200,000 men, got it right. That 200,000 men properly led, properly employed, was going to defeat the Ukrainian military. And even if the NATO continued to provide Javelin missiles and Stinger missiles, those are light weaponry, they don't change the game. But when NATO starts pouring in the heavy weaponry, an endless stream of it, apparently, that changes it. And what we saw is over the course of the summer, the Ukrainians built a new army. This army is not a Ukrainian army. And this is the point I made. This is why this is phase 3. The Ukrainian army was defeated in phase 2. What we have right now and what we saw in operation in September is a NATO army, literally a NATO army. It's better than any army NATO has. Those Ukrainian forces that launched that attack, I'll just straight up say, you put them against the German and the French armies combined, they would crush them, defeat them. Why? The French and the Germans haven't a clue how to fight right now. They're all, the Germans are too busy eating Wiener Schnitzel, getting fat. The French are drinking wine. They haven't fought a war like this. Those Ukrainians that are doing this are all combat hardened. They know what war is. They've seen death firsthand. So when they run into fire, they know what it is. They've been tested. They're using NATO tactics. They're not using the old Soviet era tactics, dismounted infantry attack, and with armor in support. This is rapid stuff. They're mounted infantry rushing a position, overwhelming the position, running through kill zones. It's a NATO army, very good NATO army. And that's the thing we need to understand. These aren't amateurs. It wasn't like the Russians got beat by, some pickup team. This is the first team. This is the best NATO can do, short of maybe the United States. It's the best NATO could do. It's a NATO army that hit them. And it wasn't just in Kharkov. This was a well thought out plan, a plan that's been months in the making. And the Russians helped make this plan happen. What happened in the Kharkov Oblast for the Russians militarily is an embarrassment. It's a humiliation. They had 2 of their premier units, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army. These are units that were resurrected after the end of the Cold War around 2016 for the sole purpose of standing up to NATO, standing up to the NATO buildup in Poland and the Baltic. These are forces that are doctrinally prepared to defend against a frontal NATO assault, and then launch a decisive counterattack. I mean, what the Ukrainians did was literally purpose-built for them to be destroyed by the premier forces of the Russian army. Why didn't it happen? And I think the answer is clear. The Russians made it quite apparent over the summer that they were going to build up offensive capability for an autumn offensive. In order to do that, I think the 1st Guards Tank Army, the 20th Combined Arms Army, and other units in the Kharkov area, which is always the less important part for the Russians. The Russians paid a lot of attention to Donbass. The Russians were very keen on securing Kherson because that protects Crimea and it protects the land bridge. But Kharkov was always sort of the redheaded stepchild up there. And so they said, okay, let's pull these forces out and pull them back into Russia and begin the process of rearming, re-equipping, retraining, and reorganizing so they can come down into the Donbass and work. So they thinned out their defenses. Doctrinally, a Russian division covers 20 kilometers, not only in terms of the breadth, but the depth, 20 kilometers in depth. It's a defense in depth. There's artillery there that's going to, fill the gaps. That they call it fire kettles, etc. You have mobile reserves already identified, so that if somebody attacks, you hit them with artillery, and there's the reserves come in and pinch them off at the flanks and destroy them. That's the Russian doctrine. They practice it all the time. It's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. None of that was in play. The Russian depth was taken away for reorganization. So you had a thin veneer at the front, and it's not even the Russian infantry battalion at the front. It was a special police unit, the SWAT team. It's like taking a Marine battalion, pulling off the front line and replacing them with, Los Angeles SWAT. I mean, LAPD SWAT are good guys. They're impressive. They look cool. They got guns. They're brave guys. They ain't infantry. They don't know how to fight armor. They're not designed to fight armor, and yet they're at the front line. Not only that, if you're going to put them there, at least have artillery to back them up. But most of the artillery was stripped away to give Russia the supremacy they were enjoying in the Donbass. The reserves. Well, they did have some reserves, but what happened to the reserves early on? Because the Ukrainian, the NATO people planning this aren't stupid. They knew the biggest weakness was in north. But the first thing you had to do was apply some of that maneuver warfare principle. So you attack in the south. It has to be a convincing attack. Politically, they set it up. Zelensky, I got 1 million-man army. He's going to retake Kherson. Over and over again, we're going to take Kherson. We're going to deny the ability to have a referendum in Kherson. We're going to reconquer Kherson. We're going to drive on Crimea. Kherson, 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 Kherson. And then they did it. They attacked, and it was a convincing attack because they came in heavy and they suffered heavy losses. And they continued to press the attack. So any Russian sitting there thinking this was a feint went, no, this is the main deal. They lost a lot. They keep coming. Deploy the reserves. Reserves come down. And at that very moment, bam, the Ukrainians hit the Kharkov Oblast with a NATO-style assault that rapidly punched through these lines, was operating in the rear. Those special police units? They were courageous as hell. Excuse me, I don't know if I could say that. Courageous as heck. These guys didn't retreat. They stood there and they fought and they won. They did all the things they're not supposed to do. They killed tanks. They killed armor. They dug in. They hooked and jabbed. They were heroic. But then the Russians realized if we allow this to happen, we're going to lose them all. They're all going to die. I mean, they're doing a great job, but they're going to die. So the Russian effort became focused on getting these isolated units out of there. So their counterattacks weren't about pinching off and destroying Ukrainian forces. It was about reaching out, maintaining contact with these OMON units, the National Guard units, the territorial units, and bringing them back. And then rapidly collapsing on a defensible posture, which is, I think, the Oxil River. And they're doing that. They did it successfully. One of the most difficult. So anybody who says that the Russians aren't professional, you have no clue what you're talking about. Because what the Russians pulled off here was a withdrawal under the conditions of pure chaos. Pure chaos, and yet the Russians had sufficient command and control and discipline to get the men out. The most precious resource any military has is its manpower. Are the Ukrainians going to be able to get propaganda value by showing, abandoned tanks, Hell yeah. And if I were the Ukrainians, man, I'd film it all week long. I'd be sitting there doing the dance on it, whatever you want to call it. I'd do it all the time because it's a great victory. Good job, guys. You did it, but you're not winning the war.
Is it sustainable? I mean, you mentioned that you believe that the Russian forces were planning an autumn offensive. Is that still on?
Well, I think this radically changes that. Here's what I think is, first of all, if I were the Ukrainians, I would have told NATO, hey, thank you for giving me this great NATO army. But now what I'm going to do is I can't launch a meaningful offensive right now because I have enough troops to do the assault and the initial exploitation. But unless I have the next wave of troops, another 40,000 NATO troops, that can go through the initial exploitation and do that dramatic punch through to create absolute chaos in the depth of the Russian rear, to throw the Russians so off guard that they're not only going to abandon Kharkov, they're going to abandon Lugansk, because otherwise they're going to be destroyed by 40,000 screaming Mimis. Unless I have those guys ready, I'm not going to launch this attack. Instead, what I'm going to do is, we know the Russians are preparing an offensive. I'm going to hold my new NATO mobile forces as a fire brigade. And as the Russians attack, I counterattack. And I pound the Russians. I stop their penetration. I bleed the Russians. That's what I would have done. They didn't do that. What they did is they expended this well-trained force to get a political gain. They got a lot of Terry on Kharkov to change the strategic calculation at all. And right now the Russians, when the enemy's doing something to your advantage, let them do it. And right now the Russians have this nice defensive shell, and the Ukrainians continue to believe that they're somehow going to continue this success, and they're bleeding themselves to death. They're getting slaughtered while they attempt to take, Limon to continue the offensives down to Kherson. It's not working. So if I were the Russians, rather than right now, I've stabilized the situation, and the Ukrainians are doing what I want them to do, which is to commit suicide. So I'm just to sit back and let them commit suicide. I would recognize a couple things. One, that by losing Kharkov, probably my overall plan has changed. So there's going to have to be some restructuring of the plan, because that's a dramatic change. Two, my timeline has changed, because something's going to happen in October, probably late September. General Mudd is going to be introduced to the fight. The rainy season is going to come, and Russia loses a lot of its advantage in terms of maneuvering. But you know who else loses it? This new NATO army that Ukraine built. It's going to get bogged down as well. So if I were the Russians, I would enjoy the stability that I've achieved, let the Ukrainians commit suicide for the next month and a half, and then let General Mudd take over and freeze the front. Not all the front, because there's this still slow grinding assault being led by Wagner against Bakhmut that's taking place. And I think the Russians will reinforce that and try and work through the fall and into the winter to liberate Donbass. I think that's their objective. It'll never hit pause. But there's no reason to carry out a major offensive in Kherson to capture Nikolaev, or push up and threaten, other towns. There might be some pressure to cleanse the other side of Zaporizhia, to push the Ukrainians back from that. We might see something there. But I think the Russians right now recognize a couple realities. They have sufficient force to take Donbass. They don't have sufficient force to do anything else. They don't have sufficient force to denazify, which is a political problem that requires the dissolution of the Ukrainian regime, and creating enough political impetus in Ukraine to reverse their constitution, to outlaw Stepan Bandera, things of that nature. Russia doesn't have the force sufficient to that task. Demilitarization used to mean getting rid of all of the NATO influence in the Ukrainian military. But if the Ukrainian military is a NATO army, demilitarization means complete annihilation of the Ukrainian army. They don't have sufficient forces. So I think Russia's going to stabilize the front, do whatever they need to do to get the front where they want it come winter. And then they're going to sit back and they're going to build up their forces. I don't think that means general mobilization. Politically, that's difficult to do. Economically, it would cause too many difficulties. While Russia's winning the economic battle, you don't want to cause any problems. And Russia's winning the economic battle. They've divorced themselves from the West. They're pivoting east. They're establishing new relationships. They're restructuring their domestic economic reality. So the last thing you'd want to do is say, okay, well, we're going to strip 1 million working class men from these factories. We're going to reallocate everything to a wartime footing. The ruble is going to plummet when we need the ruble to be strong, we're going to weaken it. No. Instead, they're going to do what they're doing already, which is training these volunteer forces. The Chechens just arrived on the scene, re-arrived with 10,000 fresh troops. But the Chechens have a training facility that they use to train non-Chechen forces, and they've been doing that. They're training up these territorial volunteers. They have something called the Odessa Brigade that they've trained up. They're training up other units like that. And I think the Russians are also going to, the Russians built something called the 3rd Armor Corps. And it's basically a new unit. It's made up of volunteers. I think the Russians are going to have to replicate that. And they're going to take, over the wintertime, I think you're going to see the Russians build up this volunteer force. They'll supplement it with some troops taken from around Russia. But keep this in mind. Russia is, the Russian military is composed of professionals. When they're given a task, they need to accomplish that task. So imagine yourself you're a Russian general in Syria. And are you going to sit there and have someone say, we're going to strip away all your resources in Syria, but we want you to continue the mission? He's going to say, hell no. I'm keeping my troops. You gave me a mission. These are the troops I need to accomplish the mission. You can't touch them. You have a peacekeeping operation in Armenia that's gone sour. Are you really going to strip away resources from that? You have the Georgians talking about a referendum to open up a second front. So you're suddenly going to strip away the resources in South Ossetia and Abkhazia for that. You have instability in Central Asia. You're going to get rid of the resources there to maintain stability. You have the Japanese talking about opening up a front on the Kuril Islands potentially. You're going to strip away your Far East forces. You have the northern military that you've built up to protect your strategic resources in the Arctic and your strategic depth. You're going to strip away the forces there. What about the new front coming up in Finland that Russia's had to allocate resources there? My point is, people keep saying, oh, there's 1.2 million Russians. How come they just can't take more troops and go down to Ukraine? No military professional would allow the dedicated resources that are already allocated to the defense of Russia's periphery to be stripped away. Because all you do now is give your opponent an additional opportunity. So Russia has to maintain its strength and yet find a way to reinforce. So I think you do that by training up these volunteers, redoubling your effort. The Wagner model is it's an interesting model. In the West, we don't understand it. We call them, we call Wagner a private military contractor. Well, with all due respect to all my fellow analysts in the West, there's no such thing as a private military contractor in Russia. First of all, there's no legal framework for it. There's nothing private about Wagner. Wagner is a unique extension of the Russian military. They work for the general command, or they have a different funding structure because legally Russia can't use their elite forces in the way that we would. So you can't take the 45th Spetsnaz Brigade and send it off to do a task in Africa. Legally, you can't do that. There's laws that are passed. What you can do is create this quasi-private organization, which is contracted troops. That's all they are. They're contracted troops. They're specialists who are either contracted directly from Russian units or people who got out who come back in. But these are guys who know how to fight. They know what they're doing. And Wagner's expanded. They're everywhere around the world. But what they're doing right now in the Donbass, these are elite assault troops who are carrying out a very precision dismemberment of the Ukrainian defenses in the most heavily defended spot on the earth today, around Bakhmut. I think the Russians will build on that model. It's a very effective model. Wagner's performed brilliantly, but they're not mercenaries. People keep calling them mercenaries. They're not mercenaries, not private. They are Russian soldiers who are fighting under a unique contractual mechanism. Let's just put it that way. And I think Russia will probably seek to have more unique contractual mechanisms that are specifically tailored to the fighting in Ukraine. And I think come springtime, we're going to see a completely different Russian military force structure, one that is capable of accomplishing all these missions.
What have the Russians learned from this, if anything, at this point?
Well, it was interesting. I did an interview last week with a gentleman, Alexander Khodorkovsky. He's the commander of the Vostok Battalion, very well known, and he writes. I didn't realize that Frontline Guy has a blog. It was fascinating. So I subscribed to his blog and I'm reading it, and he put out something very interesting today. He said, we are military professionals and we have to respect the fact that we got beat. We got beat in Kharkov. I mean, they beat us. He said, but we learned. And what we learned is that we now know how they fight, and they will never beat us again. You can pull the trick once, and you pulled that trick, but now we know. So what have the Russians learned? I think the first thing is, I think they've grown up to realize that they're fighting NATO. I mean, there's always been that rhetoric, but it's a lot of propaganda going on. You know this, and everything. So, oh, we're fighting NATO, we're fighting NATO, but deep inside, they're like, we just fight the Ukrainians. And so you get complacent, you get lazy, you get sloppy. No, you're fighting NATO. And because you were complacent, lazy, and sloppy, NATO slaps you around like a little girl. And now you've got to learn from that. And I think Russia learned from that. The other thing is, I think Russia learned that you got to get back to basics. I mean, this is the thing. The First Guards Tank Army would not have been defeated like this, but the First Guards Tank Army wasn't there. It was there in name only. The 20th Combined Arms Army wouldn't have gotten defeated like this, but they weren't there. Basics is when you're given a front to defend it doctrinally, defend it the way you're supposed to. There's a reason why you have doctrine, because doctrine defines the operations that you train your people to do. You have a unit trained to do this job, let them do the job. But because you're capped at 200,000, sometimes you get sloppy. You have to rob Peter to pay Paul. They can't get away with that with a NATO army. You could have gotten away with that with the Ukrainian army. You can't get away with the NATO army. The other thing is, I think Russia suffered a major intelligence failure here. I'm just going to be straight up honest. In 1973, the Israeli Defense Force, one of the finest fighting forces in the world with the vaunted Mossad and the vaunted Amman military intelligence, they were unable to accept the fact that Egypt was getting ready to launch an attack across the Suez Canal. And yet Egypt did it, caught them with their pants down, one of the greatest military intelligence failures in modern history. I think this is going to be right up there with it. I think the Russians had an intelligence failure. And I think that the failure is the following. I think you have good people on the lower end of the analytical scale who are collecting information and assessing it. Why do I say that? Because if I was an intelligence analyst, I'm also going to be looking at open source. And every open source analyst said, hey, they're pouring in equipment. Hey, they're rebuilding the military. Hey, they're going to attack. So I would have to imagine that there's a junior analyst down there going, yeah, you're right, but I also got the satellite photos. Hey, boss, they're getting ready to launch a major attack. And he sends it up to the next echelon, middle management. The thing about middle management everywhere is all middle management wants to become senior management at some point. Now, and the reason why I bring that up is that middle management now has been handed a briefing from this young guy whose career is just starting. And it says they're going to attack, and middle management goes, oh, Christ, we don't have the resources necessary to handle this attack. But middle management also knows that the last time middle management sent us up to higher levels, they were slapped down because higher levels said, we ain't busting the 200,000 cap. That ain't going to happen. We got 200,000, deal with it. And the guy who did that got reassigned to Siberia. And they're like, yeah, we don't want to go to Siberia. We sort of like this frontline combat pay. So we're going to alter this a little bit. We're going to change the conclusions. We're going to soften this a little bit. And we're going to get up the middle management that says they do have this potential, but in the past, we've been able to deal with it. We don't think it's going to be as big, et cetera. And upper management went, oh, thank you. See, upper management, I don't think was told that this was going to happen, because if upper management had been told about that, they wouldn't have withdrawn the First Guards Tank Army. They wouldn't have withdrawn the 20th Combined Arms Army. They would have told military, you can't talk about an autumn offensive. You have to defend Kharkov. But no one told them about this because they were scared to tell their bosses about this. You can't have that in the military. Your job as an intelligence officer is never to tell your boss what they want to hear. It's only to tell them what the facts are, regardless of where the chips fall. And then it's your boss. That's why they get paid more money than you, because they have the obligation to receive this information and act on it. They're the ones that are supposed to do that. But the system failed. They didn't brief them accordingly, and the bosses didn't make it receptive. I don't think the higher echelon, from Putin on down, made it receptive to be told the truth. I think they said, we have a 200,000 cap. We ain't messing with that cap. We got bigger things to worry about. Economic transformation, freezing Europe in the wintertime. We're looking at the big picture, boys. You're the military. You handle the problem. The military's going, we don't have the resources sufficient to handle the problem. And senior leadership said, I don't want to hear it. Deal with it. And this is the result.
Yeah, Scott, do you think that's going to change? Do you think the 200,000 cap is going to go, or are they going to stick with within the parameters set?
No. I think I think one of the big lessons here is that they're going to have to double the amount of troops that they've allocated for this. The question now is what legal framework they do, because when you say special military operation, that's not just propaganda. In the West, they're like, oh, it's just that the Russians don't want to call it an invasion. No, a special military operation has a whole bunch of legal things attached to it. Define how the operation's done, define funding, legal authorities, etc. I don't know what Russia's going to do legally, because to be honest, I'm not an expert on the Russian legal systems. But so I think the existing system allows this contracting that we talked about. So I think within the existing special military operation legal framework, you can increase the number of troops by having these new contractual relationships, new volunteer systems. If you can't do that, then there might have to be a redesignation for legal purposes. And then some people have floated the idea that it's going to be called a counterterrorism operation, which suddenly gives the Russians this latitude that they don't currently enjoy. Because there's a lot of people saying, why isn't Russia doing the US equivalent of the strategic air campaign? What we did in Desert Storm, pounding Iraq into submission for 6 weeks, so that by the time we launched the offensive, it was a 100-day war and the Iraqi army was swept off the battlefield. I honestly believe that if Russia had gone into Ukraine using that philosophy, they would have won this war very quickly. We already know they beat the Ukrainian army. I just think they would have done it on an accelerated framework, but it would have been horrific for everybody involved. And Russia sought not to do that, because to do that, you'd have to declare war. And Russia, here's the other problem people don't understand. Russia had no legal basis to declare war, none whatsoever. And Russia would have been in violation of international law had they declared war. What Russia did was genius. They but they recognized the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. And in doing so, they created the ability for Russia then to enter into a collective security agreement, which now made the Ukrainian threat against the Donbass a threat to the collective security arrangement. And under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Russia is able to carry out preemptive self-defense by addressing the threat to the collective security arrangement. You know who else invented this? Because Russia didn't invent this. A lot of credit to the Russian guys who put this together. But NATO invented it when they went against Kosovo. The difference between this is that the NATO excuse, genocide of the Albanians, was a fabrication. Didn't happen. So NATO lied their way to a war. The Russian excuse of the Ukrainians are getting ready to launch an attack against the Donbass was real. This was a real deal. But that is the legal foundation of this conflict. It's still collective self-defense, preemptive self-defense under Article 51. Now, in order to change this, you've got to come up with a new legal framework. So that's why a lot of people, what I'm trying to tell people is that people are frustrated the Russians hung on to the special military operation designation, but it's a legal designation tied to the realities of international law and domestic Russian law. And, Russia's a dictatorship. No, it's not. It's a democracy. It's not a Jeffersonian democracy. You can't have a Jeffersonian democracy when the CIA is buying opposition politicians trying to, tear down Russia from within. But it is a democracy. Vladimir Putin wins elections by 53%, 60%. He's not Saddam Hussein, who wins elections by 98%. That was a dictatorship. Russia's not a dictatorship. So Russia has to comply with the law. And that's what they're doing so far. And if they want to change the designation, it will be a new legal reality. But here's the risk. Let's say you call it an anti-terrorism operation. Are you now saying that the Zelensky government is a terrorist organization? And the second you open up that name calling, because there's legal ramifications to that, now the United States might be free to call you a terrorist organization. So you don't want to get into name calling. You want to stick to principles. So I do think that they can stay with the special military operation, but it's going to require them to focus on the contractual relationships that they've developed. They're going to have to expand upon that to maintain the SMO designation, because SMO designation still allows them to carry out demilitarization, denazification, and the liberation of the Donbass. They can accomplish all those missions under the SMO. What they can't do is divert sufficient military, because here's the other thing, bring up the law. Remember I talked about all those military missions that are out there? Each one of them is linked to specific legislation that authorizes, for instance, the creation of the Far East Military Command. Far East Military Command is given a responsibility by Russian legislation. It's not that the Russian military sits there and makes up and says, I need a military command, I'm going to get one. No, it has to be budgeted for. It has a mission. It has responsibilities. Resources are allocated to accomplish that mission. Legally speaking, So you violate Russian law if you strip away those capabilities and send them to Ukraine, void of legal authority to do so, which can only come with a declaration of war and a complete reallocation of military resources. So if you're not going to declare war, if you're not going to declare general mobilization, don't talk about stripping away resources that are by law allocated to a specific problem.
Scott, you mentioned the word risk a few seconds ago, and George and I have been talking about the specific risk. I read your article in Consortium News. I was very, very good. When George told me you were going to come on with us, I was very excited. But I don't have any doubt that the Russians will win militarily and against NATO, which I want to talk about maybe in a few minutes. But the biggest risk is the hearts and minds, because the withdrawal and regrouping of Russian troops abandoned civilians on the ground. And for me, that was always the trump card. People ask me all the time, why is it taking so long? Why is it taking so long? They have the capacity. Why don't they commit more troops? And my answer was, not being a military expert, is that convincing the people that are liberated that they're going to stay and they're going to be safe. I don't know, can you undo what's been done now? Because that's what I fear the most. You're the military guy. You know all about this stuff. I have scant knowledge of military technology, but I do understand that if you make a promise and you break your promise, earning that trust in this situation is near impossible.
You are so correct. And there's only one solution to this. First of all, the Russian people know what happened when Nazi Germany invaded. And they know that their military retreated and abandoned large segments of Soviet territory, Russian territory, to the Germans out of military necessity. And they know what happened to the people that were there, and they know how tragic that was, but they were willing to accept it because they were educated about the total picture, the total reality, why this decision was made, et cetera. This purely me as an American speaking, but I've studied Russia long enough to agree with what you're saying, Peter, about the psychology of the Russian people. If the Russian command, military and civilian, try to pass this off as business as usual, what happened in Kharkov, business as usual. We wanted to withdraw the whole time. This was pre-planned. We've done this. They do that, they're making a huge mistake, because right now, as we speak, hundreds, if not thousands, of pro-Russian citizens, civilians, who lived in the areas previously occupied by Russians are being arrested, tortured, raped, murdered. We know they're being murdered. We've seen the bodies. This is an absolute disgrace if it's business as usual. Meaning that, oh, we planned to do this the whole time. If that's the myth you're trying to sell, then shame on you. And frankly speaking, people have every reason to doubt your commitment to the Russian nation. Because again, I study Putin, Vladimir Putin. I don't mean to be dismissive. He's the Russian president, so I study the Russian president. I've read his work. I listened intently to his speech that he made in, I believe it was April 2005 to the Federal Assembly. When he talked about, it's the famous one. It's been quoted many times, or misquoted, I like to say, the greatest, catastrophe was, but he said a catastrophe, not the catastrophe. But was the collapse of the Soviet Union, not because of the Soviet Union. Putin has no love for the Soviet Union. It's because it abandoned tens of millions of Russian people. And he spoke of the Russian nation. And that's an important phrase, the Russian nation, because the Russian nation isn't defined by the borders of the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is defined by Russian people and people that are that aren't Russian, but part of Russia, like Ukrainians. They're part of the Russian nation, at least those who identify linguistically and culturally. So this is all been, and when you listen to the justification he made to come in, his February 21st speech and his February 24th speech, about the Russian nation, the Russian nation, the Russian nation. Okay, great words, Mr. President. Live up to them. Live up to your words, because what just happened in Kharkov was a total abandonment of the Russian nation. Oh yeah, they live in Ukraine. It's the Russian nation, as you defined it, Mr. President. You defined it this way, not me. You and your military just abandoned them. And they're being slaughtered. What does that mean about your commitment to the Russian nation? So be honest. Have some military officer come up here and say, we made mistakes. It's our fault. We betrayed you by our errors. We apologize. We beg your forgiveness. We beg your forgiveness. We are coming for you. We will never abandon you. This will never happen again.
Why hasn't he done this? I absolutely agree with you. I mean, you expect him to make such an address to the nation because people are watching this, you know, they're reading stuff on the internet and they're wondering, why the hell did we do this? We made all these commitments, we made all these promises and we abandoned them. Why hasn't he come before the nation to explain what the hell's going on?
And if I can add to that, Scott, if I can add to it.
Yeah.
Importantly, they've been talking about these referenda coming up. Well, I think that what's happened in Kharkov, and that you want to talk about referenda, I think it's a dead letter. That's tone deaf.
Yeah, I have to be honest. If I were a Ukrainian mayor in the Kherson Oblast, I'd tell the Russians, hold off on the referendum right now. I, in good faith, can't go to my people and say, vote for this, because you're going to screw us. Okay, you've already shown what you're going to do in Kharkov. Is that our future? Don't tell me that you're not ever going to do that, because you just did it. So, you know, that Russia doesn't get to play that card twice. Here's the thing. Putting on the politics, and this is always my weakest point. So I could be going way off base here because I'm getting into areas that, but I think there's a concern in Moscow not to put the cart before the horse on this one. And what I mean by that is, if you get out and apologize before you've rectified the situation, meaning that you're the best posture, the best time to go forward and be honest with your people is when you've solved the problem. I don't think they've solved the problem. I think they're solving the problem, but I think this was a huge defeat. And I think it disrupted the Russians tremendously. And I think there's still a lot of reorganization going on. It's also hard to be honest to the Russian people when you don't know exactly what happened yourself. So I think there has to be some sort of, you know, bring in stability, sit there and reflect on what the hell happened, and then make sure that you have solutions in place. Because here's the risk. If you go out and promise something, let's say Putin comes out today and gives President Putin, again, I don't want to be seen disrespectful. I would do the same thing about President Biden. You know, they are the chief executives of their respective nations. So President Putin comes out and he does the speech with, which I think we're in agreement, must be given. This isn't an option, Mr. President. You have to do this. But he can't get out there and make that promise unless he can provide it, because you only get to abandon the people once. You get to do it one time and say, I will never do that again. But if you're going to say, I will never do that again, you have to make sure that not only are the words honest, but you have the means to guarantee this will never happen again, which means the Ukrainians will never break through to Kherson. Ukrainians will never threaten Lugansk. Ukrainians will not hold on to the Donbass. And the Ukrainians aren't going to shell Crimea, bring down the Kerch Bridge, and all this kind of stuff. You got to make sure that that's there. Then you come forward and say, this will never happen again. And the most important part, we're coming for you. And you have to deliver. So it's a speech that has to be given, but I don't think politically, even though we agree there's a political necessity for it, the timing of it, it might be premature, because politically, you don't want to make those commitments. You know, if I were Putin, am I going to trust my military right now? Don't worry, boss, we got Kherson secured. Son of a bitch, son of a gun, you told me you had Kharkov secured. You know, and now what happened? So before I go out and say, because I will never abandon the people of Kherson. The Ukrainians just broke through, and it's all hell, man. We're all running to Crimea right now. We got to fall back on. I just told him it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, he has to have contact with his inner LBJ. Scott, something that we talked about yesterday on my program, which I think I'd like to get a little bit more focus on, because of the implications of this NATO war against Russia. That's what makes it so much more existential, because now it's very clear to everyone that this is a NATO, I mean, it's not even like a proxy war anymore. It's NATO versus Russia, okay? And I think you put it very well. I mean, the ground troops predominantly are Ukrainian, but everything else is NATO here.
Yeah.
And so I think the three of us believe, and our viewers believe, that Russia will prevail militarily. I don't know what that means at this point, considering what's happened in Kharkov, but this would be a massive strategic defeat for NATO. And what are the implications of that? Because, you know, we've focused very, very narrowly in our conversation here, but all three of us have been watching one statement after another coming out of the European Union, and particularly the Hungarians, okay? And they're not amiss by that. I mean, so this NATO, because George and I have made it very clear on our podcast that the EU is subservient to NATO. We've seen this happen. And so it's all intertwined here. So the tensions that are building up here, NATO has to win to continue the legitimization of the EU and its project and its hopes of expansion, and of course for NATO. And that's not going to be the case. I mean, we're really approaching the abyss here. Your thoughts?
Yes, if we freeze frame right now and we realize because this is a political problem more than it is a military problem. Look, NATO's gotten beaten before. They just lost a 20-year war in Afghanistan, okay? So it's not like this is a newsflash for NATO. And NATO is going through.
You could say that was the far, far, far backyard. This is the front porch.
It's the front porch, and NATO's put a lot more political commitment into this fight, but not enough political commitment to transform it into a military commitment beyond vision of goods. NATO's not ready. NATO isn't ready to go to war with Article 5 designated NATO troops. So they've created this proxy NATO army in Ukraine, and they're pouring resources into that. And that is a political decision, that there's serious costs associated with that. So that's why, once again, I'm going to bring up General Winter. General Winter is Russia's friend, because Russia will have a hard time coming up with a viable diplomatic off-ramp to this conflict if Europe and NATO, as it's currently configured, are still intact at the time of the defeat, the time of the need to recognize the defeat. See, I believe in that there is going to be revolutionary change in Europe this winter. And I use that term very purposefully. I've always spoken about the difficulty a democratic government's going to have to stay in power when they enact policies that cause economic devastation to their populations. But I think that the potential for the scope and scale of what's about to hit Europe is such. There's an old saying, any civil society is 9 missed meals away from total chaos and anarchy. I think there's going to be many 9 missed meal moments in Europe this coming winter. And I think that the artifice of democracy could very well be swept away by the emotion of revolution. That people aren't going to be patient enough to work through a system that's been built and controlled by political elites to sustain the political elites, that they're going to sweep the slate clean. And I'll tell you, the country I feel that's most at risk of this is Germany. You see, listen to the arrogance of the German foreign minister. Yeah. I don't care what the people think. I will continue to pursue this policy, even if it causes harm at home. I mean, what? Really? That's what the French invented the guillotine for. And I'm not encouraging that. I don't want violence in Europe, but I'm just saying that with that kind of narcissistic hubris and arrogance, you already hear Germans talking about there might be the necessity for martial law, that they might have to call out the troops. Well, that's how it ends, guys. Tsarist Russia brought out the troops. And what happens when the Cossacks decided they didn't want to run over the people anymore? And the Cossacks decided it was a better idea to run over the imperial family. Imperial Russia went away overnight. And And Germany is literally on the cusp of this kind of revolutionary moment, because I think there's a growing sense of betrayal by the German people about what their government did. Germany, like the rest of Europe, has built a very comfortable society.
You bet. Yeah.
And that comfort comes from one thing. I mean, you're going to say, well, the Germans are very efficient planners and they're really good economists and they're hard
Cheap
workers.
energy.
Cheap Russian gas for 50 years. The money that Europe saved, Germany saved on that, allowed. There's a reason why the Mercedes-Benz is such a good car. It's because the Germans can focus a lot of effort on quality control, because keep that factory roaring. That factory, and exports machines, builds salaries, builds pension funds and all that. But that's all because of cheap Russian gas that powers it. And that gas is now off. And I think there's going to be a realization of the people that the gas didn't need to be turned off. Not only that, that gas could have been doubled and made even cheaper. All we had to do is hit the on switch on Nord Stream 2, and we'd be living the high life. What about Ukraine? What about Ukraine? Because what they're beginning to realize is, you've lied to us. This isn't the bastion of democracy. I mean, a German newspaper recently found out the reality of Ukraine when they interviewed the Ukrainian ambassador, and they talk about the visit to Stepan Bandera's grave. That would be the equivalent of me asking a German, why did you, I mean, we don't know where Hitler's grave is because Hitler doesn't have a grave, but let's just say by an accident of history, I mean, we know where Hitler was born, we know all this. What I'm trying to say is, if modern day Germans bragged about making a pilgrimage to Hitler's birthplace, I drank beer in the Munich beer hall where Hitler had his poosh. Look at me, aren't I cool? I went to the place where Hitler did this. I went to Hitler's place. Hitler's a great guy. He's a cool guy. Hitler's a good guy. I call him out on that and say, there's something wrong with you. And I also say there's something wrong with the government that appointed you, because these are value systems that shouldn't be there. So when you have an ambassador, a Ukrainian ambassador, bragging about visiting the grave of Stepan Bandera, when you have the president of Ukraine saying, hey, he's just a Ukrainian nationalist, a lot of people support him, it's cool, it's cool. No, it's not cool to support Hitler. It's not cool to support Stepan Bandera. And I think there's going to be a growing realization amongst the European working class that they've been lied to, they've been misled, that this isn't a good government. This is a brutal government. This is a dysfunctional country. This is a country that, let's take Putin's arguments to the extreme. It's a fake country. It shouldn't exist. I mean, whatever, but we don't want to sacrifice our lives for these people. We're not going to do it anymore. And when that moment comes, the sense of betrayal combined with the abject ruin that has been wrought by the policies of those whom they elected to represent them. They didn't elect them to represent them so the ruling elite could become richer and more powerful. They're supposed to keep things good. And the bargain was, while you get richer and more powerful, we get cheap Russian gas that keeps us employed. I get to go on my 30-day paid vacation every August and still have plenty of time left over for a Christmas vacation. Well, I don't even have to work anymore because cheap Russian gas makes the German economy go on automatic. We can bring in Turkish laborers. I just don't have to do anything.
Yeah,
unless the governments apply repression, because after all, we saw what happened during COVID time. The government used pretty powerful coercive tools. You know, they had cops out there clubbing people over the head. They had these savage dogs. I mean, remember that, in Holland, they unleashed these German shepherds on the protesters. Why wouldn't the governments of Europe do exactly the same thing?
All right, well, let's talk about COVID. All right, so I want to suppress the people. And the way they suppressed them, they said, you're going to stay home. We're going to lock you in. They said,
still need energy.
I can't work. We're going to write you a check. We're going to pay 80% of your salary. That means I got to stay at home and turn on the TV and surf the internet. And I mean, I have to control the thermostat so when it gets hot, I can turn on the air conditioning. When it gets cold, I can turn on the heat. Oh no, I'm going to be at home. Okay, wham, wham, wham. What happens when you go, we're going to suppress you, you got to stay at home. And they say, we need our salary. Here's 80% of your salary. But the price of everything, when you finally let me out of the house to go shopping, food has gone up 200%. So I can't eat. I'm hungry. Not only that, when I come home, I'm freezing because there's no damn heat. I can't turn on the lights because we have rolling blackouts. Guess what, government? I ain't staying home anymore. Neither are a million of us. We're coming out on the street and we're coming for you. Now you bring out the cops. And the cops are going to be given a choice. Shoot your own people or turn and join them. And that's the fundamental question. Will the tools of oppression and suppression remain loyal to a government that has fundamentally failed the nation? Because this isn't about a COVID pandemic. This isn't about throwing the fear of COVID-19. This is about fundamentally failing your own people, systemically starving your people, systemically freezing your people to death. Will the tools of suppression and oppression remain loyal to a failed government?
What the EU is going to have to face, I mean, it's obvious to us, but it's something they don't want to admit, is that they can print all the money they want, but they can't print natural gas. See, this is their dilemma, okay? They always, let's get a special fund, and always they do this here, okay? And they just go further and further into debt, okay? But you can't print natural gas, okay? And I think like bowling pins over the next few months going into spring, I think we're going to see government after government after government. And I hope Sergeant Schultz is the first one to go. And I would really like to see Liz Truss have the shortest premiership in the history of British politics.
I think they're all doomed. I think you're going to be able to count the number of European politicians that survive the winter on one hand. And most of those are going to be people who have enacted policies that allow continued access to Russian gas, because that's the key. If you got Russian gas flowing right now, you're probably going to make it through the winter.
Well, speaking of gas, Scott, and I remember an appearance you made on my program a few months ago, and we were talking about the special military operation, which I think you kind of straightened me out on that, and I appreciate it. But then I said, what about just cutting off the gas? And you were kind of holding back on that. How do you feel about that now?
Well, the reason why I held back on that is that Russia has a reputation of being a reliable source of energy. That Russia signs contracts, and their contract is the word is their bond. If it's in the contract, Russia's going to deliver to that contract. And when you and I had that conversation, that Russia was still trying to be, because Russia at that time was trying to make this transition to the East. So if you come in and for political points say, I'm shutting down German energy, then you turn to the Indians and go, I'm a reliable supplier of energy. The Indians are going, really? You just broke every contract you ever had. Russia had to make sure that when it came time to shut down energy, that it wasn't Russia breaking the contract, that it was Europe breaking the contract. And without exception, every time Russia hits the off switch, it's because Europe has failed to perform its contractual obligations. So Russia has retained its status as a reliable. Look at the embarrassment of it's like they didn't even read their contract. Did you see the European or the German energy ministry? They're shutting down all the gas, but we're going to still have to pay full price up until 2040 or whatever it is, because that's the contract. Yep. Yep. Because to violate that contract, I mean, because right now they're shutting down the gas because, again, the Russians are very clever. Oh, the Siemens pump, quality control, safety issues. You Germans are very safety conscious people, right? That's why we couldn't do Nord Stream 2, right? Because we couldn't pass all the little tests that you put in there. Yeah, we got the same problem. There's some leaks. We got to shut, but we can't repair them because the sanctions are just sloppy mess, guys. We're sorry, but off switch. And the Germans, Germans can't blame anybody but themselves. So, but now the Germans have to realize that not only aren't they getting the gas, they have to pay for the gas because the contract stipulates even failure to delivery that isn't the fault of Russia. Russia gets compensated in full. That if the fault of failure to delivery, failure to perform is on the part of the Germans, you still have to pay. That Russia can't be held accountable. Now, even though Russia's not getting paid, at least right now the contract vehicle is retained. And so the Russians are very clever. I just have to say that, I had this argument with other people who are energy security professionals. And I said, you're trying to tell a gas station owner how to run his gas station. Okay. and you don't know anything about the gas station. You raise pigs and you're trying to tell a gas station owner how to run his gas station. And what Europe has done, I use another one, is they're sitting there criticizing the gas station manager, mocking him. Meanwhile, they're on a cross-country trip in a gas-guzzling vehicle, and suddenly they find themselves stuck in the middle of nowhere, out of gas, and they're wondering why the gas station manager isn't coming to their assistance. I'm sorry, don't mock Russia. It's not a gas station masquerading as a country. It's a country that has a very significant oil and gas industry. And these guys are masters not only of the Russian domestic energy market, but the global energy market. Russia plays the global energy market better than anyone, better than Saudis. And the Saudis will admit it. They've been played by the Russians. The Russians beat them every time they go head to head because Russia knows the industry.
That's why the Saudis completely have caved to the Russians and work with them instead of against them. Also, the laughable logic, okay, this price cap idea is it's fading because it's just so utterly ridiculous. But
stupid.
The tax windfall, the windfall profits of oil majors. I'm not going to go to bat for oil companies, okay? But I mean, if the policies these national governments have made energy so high, then you turn around and you say, well, we're going to tax you more, and they're going to turn and say, but this is a result of your policies, not our policies. We're reacting to the marketplace, okay? I mean, they can't get anything right whatsoever.
No, and then, but again, it's short-sightedness, because then what's going to happen, say in 5 years, they're going to be screaming to the companies, why aren't you investing in downstream production? Why aren't you drilling new wells? Why aren't you putting all your billions up there? And they're going to say, because of you. Yeah. Because why would I ever invest in this infrastructure? Because in order for this infrastructure to pay off, I need 30 years of proven performance. I have to tell because remember, we don't get to fool our constituents like you do. We actually work for a board, and we have shareholders who meet every once in a while and want to know why we're not making money. And it's called capitalism for a reason. And you have just stripped away my ability to make money. And now you want me to go to them and talk about long-term investments. And we can't commit to a long-term investment because of your policies. Smoke dope, man. It's not going to happen that way. No, this is the short-sightedness of everything. This should have been thought through from the beginning. There was ways to deal with Russia. I mean, it's water under the bridge, so it's not hurting anybody. But I have to tell you, if I were managing the economic sanctioning of this, I would have studied Russia very carefully and identified and exploited known weaknesses. The dependency on the oligarchs. Why in God's name would you steal all the oligarchs' money, disenfranchising them overnight? Because all you did is make Vladimir Putin very happy. Because suddenly he doesn't have to worry about the oligarchs anymore. That's why he gave the speech where he told them, get the hell out of the country.
I need to push back a little bit on that one there. I mean, the current government doesn't have to worry about oligarchs. They haven't had to worry about oligarchs for a very, very long time. That is the major upshot of the Yukos affair. As a matter of fact, is that what I find very interesting is that when President Putin goes on foreign trips and it's like if trade is high on the agenda, the so-called oligarchs are there taking notes what we're supposed to do, okay? Because oligarchs are extremely well-paid civil servants, okay? And it's worked very, very well for the last 15 years. But I get your point. I mean,
my point is that he's politically.
If you're going to steal, I mean, you can't talk about values and the rule of law and stealing people's property around the world, okay? And in that sense, if it's possible, if there's a mechanism, and probably they will, because there's always a way around sanctions, these very super rich Russians are going to start bringing their money back home instead of exporting it because the thought of having it stolen from them.
Right. My point wasn't that Putin has to worry about them politically, but you made the point. They're sitting around the table taking notes because they matter, because they are.
I don't deny that.
Well, that's my point. My point isn't to try and turn the oligarchs politically against them. I'm saying that I can, if I were building a sanctions program to squeeze the Russian economy, I would use the oligarchs in my benefit. I wouldn't neuter myself up front by removing them. I would also remember that there was about 20% of the Russian electorate that was woven into the framework of the West, people who had employment. They were employed by Western companies. This is a big voting bloc. And I wouldn't encourage a divorce. I'd work on them to create political opposition. I'm just saying I would have taken a completely different approach to economic sanction instead of the one that was taken, which promoted the absolute divorce from the West, which would have been politically impossible for Putin to do on his own. If Putin had woken up one day and said, I'm going to divorce myself from the West and create all this economic harm in Russia, he might not be president anymore.
Right. But the problem, what's extraordinary, though, is that the Europeans went along with something that was always going to work against their interests. I mean, the Americans can do it because America is a big energy producer of its own, big agricultural producer. And, you know, it can withstand the consequences of the sanctions. Europe is not a big energy producer. Europe is an energy consumer. And for Europe to engage in the sanctions war, I mean, that just made absolutely no sense. And that's why Europe is where it is. And, you know, America's doing pretty nicely.
I think Europe, there's a couple factors. One, we have to start with the big picture. There is no independent Europe anymore. The notion that Europe is capable of formulating and implement an independent foreign policy or an independent national security policy has been thrown out the window. Europe is nothing more than an adjunct of the United States. That's it. That doesn't mean that the European politicians don't have to pay attention to the needs and wants of the European people, but it means that that they translate those needs and wants in a way that best supports American policy objectives. And therefore, these politicians and this economic elite, and this is the question: did they believe the Americans, or were they just too weak to oppose the Americans?
Does it make any difference? Does it make any?
Well, it doesn't ultimately, but it does impact, you know, how much I condemn them and mock them.
Me too.
If they believe the Americans, then shame on them. Yeah. But because there was. The United States said, don't worry about it. We have a plan. We have a plan. Now, my alarm bell would have gone up when the second we implement the sanctions, the United States is running to Algeria and saying, oh, by the way, can you increase the amount of natural gas? And the Algerians went, no. And if I were the Europeans, I'm like, is that your plan?
And Biden goes to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and then call to Saudi Arabia and be told, no. That's your plan. A plan usually means that you've already secured these relationships, that you have it in writing, cemented, done, so that there's not a question when the Russians tone down gas, Algerian gas goes up. The Russians do X, LNG tankers show up, infrastructure's been developed. We have a subsidy plan in place so that the price doesn't skyrocket, that we immediately put a cap on it, having billions of dollars. Like, for instance, $650 billion that we stole from the Russians, we immediately reallocate to subsidize the rise in price. That's a plan. The U.S. didn't have a plan. The U.S. nice. The U.S. went, you know, oh, sorry. Oh, by the way, I mean, I love this part. We encourage Europe, no Russian oil, no Russian gas, cut yourself off. Meanwhile, a lot of people, you know, the refineries that we have in the Gulf Coast are specifically configured to a grade of oil that can only be acquired in Venezuela or somewhere in the Urals. Now, we don't buy Venezuelan oil anymore because we sanction them to death. So it only comes from the Urals. Ask yourself, why haven't the refineries in the United States shut down for the multi-billion-dollar retooling necessary to bring in a different grade of crude? Yep. Because the United States has never stopped buying Russian oil. We don't buy it directly anymore. Yep. We get it from India. You see, yep. India is buying all the oil.
At a premium.
And then we pay even more. And so off it goes. And then we have to do stuff like reduce the strategic reserve to the lowest level in decades to offset the price of doing the hypocrisy and the ignorance of the United States is just unbounded. I mean, I've been critical of my government for a long time. I just want to say this up front because a lot of people, I get asked this a lot. You call yourself a patriot, but yet you criticize your government. Dude, I never took a oath of allegiance to the government. Government is of the people, by the people, for the people. The people is defined by the Constitution of the United States of America. That's what I took an oath to. The most patriotic thing I can do is speak out against the policies of my government when I disagree with the policies. That's why they invented freedom of speech. The First Amendment isn't so that I can gossip on the internet. The First Amendment is so that I, as a citizen, can step out without fear of prosecution or persecution and speak out against the policies of my government. So it's the most patriotic thing I can do. And that's why I've taken that route to speak out against them. But since I've been doing it, I'm just confounded by, you'd think after Iraq, you could say, well, we could never be that bad again. Oh man, yes, we can. We have been. And what the level of incompetence about this Russia policy is, I give the Russians high points. I do. I speak very well of the Russian government and the professionals in their foreign ministry and all that. But come on, Russia, be honest. We made it so easy.
Easy.
Okay, you really didn't have to get too creative now, did you? We didn't make you really work for this. We just sort of handed it to you on a silver platter because we're really bad. I mean, that's the reality of it. I'm not trying to put Russia down, but I'm saying, before you run around and do too many victory laps, understand that this is the biggest gift. American incompetence is the biggest gift that's ever been given to you in the last decade. Because Russia's emerged in the last decade, what should have been a very difficult path for Russia, what should have been an extremely difficult path for Russia, not because Russia's bad and doesn't deserve it, but because Russia was in a difficult position because of the 1990s and because of the reality of the Russian economic situation. This should have been very hard for Russia to transition from the unipolar world dominated by America to a multipolar world where Russia is playing a leading role.
Right. But it's still quite difficult because, as we were discussing earlier, Russia's objectives, political objectives in Ukraine, are not going to be easy to achieve because the Zelensky gang, it's not going anywhere. And while the Zelensky gang is there, they're going to keep getting arms from the United States, and continuing to wage this war. So
what happens in the spring? What happens in the spring when the governments that support the supply of weaponry are no longer in power? What happens in the spring when European priorities shift from underwriting a war in Ukraine to salvaging a life in Europe? The Zelensky gang ain't long for this world, in my opinion.
I agree.
First of all, Zelensky's in a continual political battle with his own Ministry of Defense. And right now, the Ministry of Defense has made a calculation that it's more important to continue access to these weaponry. They have to because their army had been defeated. They need the weapons. And as a result, they're willing to sacrifice thousands of Ukrainian troops. This is the thing that people don't understand. The bloodshed that took place this summer, slaughter of Ukrainian troops, was done primarily because Ukraine had withdrawn some of their best forces to get retrained and re-equipped and reorganized and replaced them with territorials with poor training. So they literally threw flesh and blood in to hold the line while they build this reserve that they just slaughtered in their failed counteroffensive. Success in Kharkov, failed in Kherson. But the Ministry of Defense has always been very critical of the Ukrainian presidency by saying that they put politics over military necessity. At some point in time, that's going to switch. And I think one of the fates that's going to bestall Zelensky is what I call the 75-cent solution, the cast of 1 9mm bullet placed right about there in the back of his head at point blank range by an officer assigned by the Ministry of Defense to solve the problem of Zelensky incompetence. The other thing that's going to happen is that he's going to lose the trust and confidence of the West. And I think this is a real risk in the near future. And at that point in time, his MI6 and SAS bodyguards are going to whisk him out of the country before the 9mm bullets put in, and he's going to live in retirement in Miami or wherever he has his villa. The worst thing that could happen is that Russia puts a Kinzhal missile into the presidency, because now you just made a martyr of this loser. mean, Zelensky is a loser. Let history, let this war run out. Let this story run out. Let this narrative run out, so that the world recognizes what an abject failure Zelensky is as a politician, as a leader, as a person. Right now, if you kill Zelensky, propaganda spin machine is going to elevate him into something that could actually reverse on you, because the myth of Zelensky is far more dangerous than the reality of Zelensky. Zelensky is incompetent. He's a fool. He's a buffoon. And the only reason why he's propped up this way is that the West has turned him into Winston Churchill, King Leonidas. But the West that's doing that, the propaganda, which is an arm of the political and economic elites, if that collapses, so does the narrative. And the best thing that could happen for Russia is not to have Zelensky being a permanent, a Charles de Gaulle type figure overseas, raising, discontent for Russia in the long term. The best thing is for Zelensky to be in a Miami villa surrounded by bodyguards until his money runs out, knowing that there's a lot of people who want to kill him because he betrayed the Ukrainian nation. That's the fate for Zelensky. And this crowd.
I think he'll end up in Panama, because there'll be people in Washington say, "Well, where did all the money go?"
Oh, Washington knows where all the money goes, because they're helping him launder the money. I mean, we know where the money's going. We know everything. He's our boy.
Oh, yeah,
he's the modern day equivalent of Yats.
There are legions of Hunter Bidens in Ukraine. Okay.
There's legions of Hunter Bidens everywhere. I mean, look, Victoria Nuland, Yats is our boy, Yatsenko. We've bought every Ukrainian government since 2014. So there's no surprises when it comes to Zelensky. We know where his money is. We know the reality of him, which is why it's so easy to create this myth. Because when you take an empty suit, it's very easy to fill an empty suit with hot air. If Zelensky was actually a person of substance, there'd be pushback against a lot of things that he's being asked to do, because what he's being asked to do is destroy the Ukrainian nation, to kill Ukrainian people. No leader would ever do what Zelensky's doing. This is not leadership. This is abject failure. Yeah. There was a time, I don't know, Zelensky at one point in time, he gave a speech when I think he was running for evidence. I will crawl on my knees to Vladimir Putin, and I will beg him not to do this. I will do anything necessary to make this not happen. Where's that man?
It's very interesting what you said, because a lot of people criticized Slobodan Milosevic when he finally capitulated to NATO, but that was because NATO had actually threatened him that if you don't capitulate, we're just going to level Belgrade. We're just going to destroy everything. There won't be a Belgrade left. And then he capitulated. He didn't wholly capitulate, but he, at least in great part, he capitulated. But that is a leader. That's a leader who's thinking about his nation and says, look, I have to think about the historical survival of this nation. I can't have Belgrade destroyed. And NATO would have done it. They would have destroyed Belgrade. Yeah. And that's the difference between somebody like Milosevic and somebody like Zelensky.
So Zelensky's destroying a generation of Ukrainians. And again, not that the Ukrainian, I don't want to get into debate about the legitimacy of the Ukrainian nation. I'm not going to sit here and give the stamp of approval on, Vladimir Putin's position that he took on February 21st and 24th. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I'm not going to go there. What I'm going to talk about is that there was a Ukrainian nation. It was defined by its eastern provinces, it's defined by its western provinces, and the provinces in the middle. That's the nation that existed on February 23rd. But because of Zelensky, that nation will never again exist, ever. So he's already destroyed his nation. It's not coming back. And I can't predict the future. I don't know what the conditions that Russia is going to put down. They're going to be satisfied with what they have now, or are they going to move on to Odessa? Are they going to make that linkage with Transnistria? Are they going to go up and retake Kharkov? Are they going to move into the Dnipropetrovsk area, Pavlograd area? I don't know. I would say that having listened to Vladimir Putin, if he means what he says, he's here to defend the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is not just the people of the Russian Federation, it's the historic nation. And that means that you can never again entrust people who fit the definition of the Russian nation to a system of governance that allows to ban Russian language, Russian history, Russian culture, to ban being Russian, period, to treat Russians as pariahs worthy of the death penalty. Zelensky crossed a line. And I don't know why the world doesn't understand it. I don't know why Israel isn't screaming at the top, because literally if you remove the word Russian and put Jew, you have Hitler's policies in 1930s and 1940s. It's the same damn thing. So why are we faking ourselves out that this is a wonderful man who has great democratic principles? He's a murderous thug who's bought into Bandera type ideology. And he's, Bandera got his reputation, well-deserved reputation, because he slaughtered people. Bandera is the kind of guy that would have his forces surround a village, pull 1,200 men, women, and children out, and rape and butcher and murder them all. That's what Bandera did. He justified it. He never once apologized for that. He did it to Poles, he did it to Russians, he did it to Jews. Zelensky is Bandera, the modern day version of Bandera. And the policies he's trying to promulgate about Russia, simply remove Russia, put Jew, and you got Adolf Hitler. That's a statement of fact. I dare anybody to take me up on that one, because you'll lose.
I would say that there are people in the intelligence community, people like Victoria Nuland, know fully well what he is all about. Okay, and we've seen this before. The 31 flavors of terrorists in Syria. I mean, this is a pattern. This is always a pattern. Okay. They always pick some of the most odious characters and they back them. They create social division. You don't need a high percentage of them either, because if they're well-moneyed, well-propagandized, they're very, very powerful.
Let me tell you something. I don't want to get too much in this, but I'm on this death list, this Mir Tvor's death list thing. And, yay. I'm on the Center for, Countering Disinformation. I'm an information terrorist, apparently, and I deserve to be arrested, prosecuted as a war criminal. And that's all fine. That's the Ukrainian government behaving as a Bandera type government does. But what brings concern to that is that literally 60 miles down the road, there's a sleepy little village called Ellenville. And in Ellenville is a camp. And in that camp is a monument to the heroes. It has 4 statues: Stepan Bandera and 3 of his fellow murderous thugs. And it's run by the Organization for the Ukrainian Nationalism /B. Right down the road from there is a church it has a plaque on it. And it's dedicated to people from the Galicia regiment, or there's a name for it. And these are the guys that pulled the trigger on the Jews at Babi Yar. So that's the OUNM, because there was an offshoot for that, for another guy who was even more violent. But the point is, here in the United States, we have monuments to this guy. Every summer, they have a camp. They hold camps where they bring in Ukrainian Americans, and they bring in Ukrainians from Canada, Ukrainians from around the world, and they dress them up in brown SS-type uniforms. And they teach them the glories of Ukrainian nationalism through the eyes of Stepan Bandera. They worship this man. They hold parades in his honor, parades where beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan Ukrainian with their nice little SS uniforms are given the hand salute here in America, right now. I mean, my God, if this was happening anywhere else, we put a B-2 bomber overhead and kill all those bastards. But no, here, freedom of speech, get to happen. You ask yourself, Victoria Nuland, she attended those camps as a kid, all right? So did half the people in Canada. Australia has a Ukrainian diaspora. The Bandera diaspora is alive and well and living, and they provide the money to create these special interest groups that advise politicians in Washington, D.C. This is why, no one stands a chance when it comes to the policy debate, because these people empower people like, Alexander Vindman. Who the hell is he? I mean, I'm not going to get into too much about him, but I'm just saying, we know who he is. He's cut out of the same piece of cloth as Victoria Nuland, the female ambassador that testified at the
Masha Jovanovic.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we know who she is. We know who they all are, and yet we pretend they don't. It doesn't matter. We turn a blind eye to the fact that every single one of them is a Bandera supporting SOB. every single one of them.
And that's because there was no real denazification that took place with these captive nations, because they were so useful to this whole CIA Cold War effort that they just ignored everything about them. I mean, imagine in France if somebody started celebrating Marshal Pétain, and Marshal Pétain did not commit anything like the crimes that Bandera did, but it would be unthinkable for anybody to celebrate Marshal Pétain or Pierre Lavelle or any of these others. But here, he says, oh, that's fine. They're on the right side because they hate Russians, so they're useful to us.
When I was growing up, war story here, my dad was stationed in West Germany, and all high school students were encouraged to put in for summer jobs. They had a whole program to allow high school kids to get summer jobs. So I put it in, and I got assigned to the veterinarian on Ramstein Air Base. And I'd ride my bike to the veterinarian. And I got there, and I thought I was going to be working for an American vet. And he said, no, you're going into the meatpacking plant, because one of the jobs of veterinarian is to inspect meat that comes in. The meatpacking plant was 100% staffed by what they called DPIs, displaced persons. These were all people who were children during World War II. They were people who were captive, brought into Germany. They worked as slave laborers, but the bottom line is they never got to go home. And the DPI camp, they're a paramilitary operation. They wear uniforms. They don't exist anymore because they've all died off. But in 1977, they were alive and well and living. They were all in their 30s, 40s, 50s. These guys were nothing more than a recruiting pool for the CIA. They all had family contacts. They all, this stuff. They were Ukrainians. They were Poles. They hated Russians with a passion. They loved the United States. They would do anything for the United States. But my point is, there was this whole secret economy and secret political reality in West Germany that nobody talks about. Nobody talks about the Gaggle organization, the origins of the modern day BND, the German intelligence service. They don't talk about the Gaggle organization was actually, I forget the department it was, but Gaggle was a general who ran the Eastern Front intelligence services, which included huge human networks. And as the Germans withdrew, they left these networks behind. And one of the networks that they left behind in Poland and Belarus and Ukraine was the Bandera network. And then when Gaggle surrendered, rather than being taken and hung by the neck until dead because of the war criminal he was, we instead brought him in. We made him work for the OSS, and it became the CIA. And then we allowed him to have his own intelligence organization. And he joined the rest of the former Nazis working in West German government. There was never denazification in Germany. I mean, yes, politically, you're not allowed to talk about Adolf Hitler. But the fact that, we allowed people who served in the Waffen-SS who served in implementing the policy. I'm not talking about the the soldier and all that, or junior officer. But if you were senior enough to have done something and you did nothing and you profited from Nazi Germany, you got promoted and all that, no, I'm sorry, you're done. You're finished. But we let Gaggle create this own thing. We let von Braun go and send us to the moon. That's what we did. And it's a reality that nobody wants to talk about. We funded the Bandera movement from 1945 until 1990. We funded it. We funded them when they were an insurgency killing Russians or Soviets. We funded them afterwards to create this global Ukrainian diaspora that worships Stepan Bandera and has real political power. We funded it, the CIA.
Krista Freeland, who was the I don't know, is she the number 2 prime minister to Justin Trudeau? But yeah, her grandfather was a prominent figure.
She might be the next Secretary General of NATO.
Yep.
I mean, that's the disgusting aspect of this. It would be perfect. It would be befitting that NATO bring a Banderist in.
Now that we're on it, I mean, George and I made a separate video about a speech that Sergeant Schultz made not long ago about EU expansion. And what George and I found really quite curious is that we couldn't figure out where Germany ended and the EU started. I mean, it was very, very opaque, okay? Basically, as George and I put it, okay, in the past mistakes were made, but we're not going to do it again. Okay, so the mission, you trust us. Okay, we owned up to it here, because one of the things that George and I found very curious is that the whole foundations of pan-European reconciliation started with the Germans and the French. And then you have in 2022 talking about the future of the EU, that reconciliation didn't even make a mention, meaning, you know, we can go on our own, because everybody knows is that the all three of us remember Deutschmark nationalism, okay, but that became the euro, which has served the same purposes, even more so than the Deutschmark ever could. And so it's something that George and I have talked about, is that, you know, has there been a did the exorcism work? Because it's
because that's the Russophobia that's now prevalent among the German elite, you know, whether it's Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, Ursula von der Leyen. It's very reminiscent of the way they spoke about the Russians in the 1930s. And so you kind of think of that, this is how they're uniting Europe. This is the basis of the united Europe. Yeah. We are not like who? We are not like the Russians. You know, we are basically united against Russia. Russia is the other. And so suddenly this liberal democratic Germany, liberal democratic EU is coming to look like a liberal version of the Third Reich.
Yep. No, look, there's a meme out there. I just found it to be funny because it's so true. And it basically was, from the German perspective. So America, let me get this right. You want me to spend 100 billion euro to rebuild an army that's going to march through Poland to fight the Russians? I just want to get it clear in case there's questions later, you know, because, but my God, have we, I mean, I thought that we had crossed the line when we allowed a German battalion to be deployed to Lithuania as part of this NATO reinforcement. I just went, no, have we not learned anything from history? I lived in Germany. I'm going to tell you right now, you scratch German, you get a Nazi. Okay, I'm going to say that right up, and I challenge any German to take me on that one.
Scott, one of the things that George and I were discussing, all of the speech by Scholz, is that we found it very curious that Georgia, Moldova, you know, opening the door for EU membership. But given the fact that young Germans probably have very little interest in the military, I would consider that, you know, Moldovans, considering how poor their country is, you know, Georgia, hey, why don't you join the EU army and they'll have their own battalions, okay? I mean, again, this is another strategy of elite capture. And because I lived in Germany for a short time, I didn't sense any militarism, but a lot of things have changed since then. I never would have expected the Greens would be the most fanatical anti-Russian Russophobes. I mean, I thought when I was there, the Greens were very, very different. But my point is that, you know, this is expansion in face of the barbarian. I mean, this is how they pivot here, okay? And of course, this serves the elites in Europe, and particularly German elites.
Yeah, let me make a clarification. My comment about Germans, scratch a German, get a Nazi, is derived from experience in the 1970s and early 1980s, when literally you scratch a German, you got a Nazi. I mean, I was invited to a home of a German kid my age, and we went down into the basement, and it was literally a war memorial to World War II, where his father or grandfather was photographed, you know, in various poses throughout, you know, the Soviet Union. All the memorabilia was there, not the Nazi flag. That was in the drawer that you had to open up to look at. And you just realize that they haven't changed. I had a gardener. We had a gardener, wonderful lady. She came with the house. We rented the house from this German landlord, and the gardener came with it. And all we had to do is make sure that she got home in bad weather. And we drove her home right at the time when there was a program called the Holocaust, and it played in Germany, and it devastated the German population. Kids were calling in and just throwing their parents under the bus. How could they lie to us? Why didn't we know about this? Why are we, da, 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 da. And she was talking about that, and she said, the Jews will never leave us alone. The Jews will never leave us alone. This is 1978. and you got a lady still hating the Jews. That's why I made that statement. I recognize that today there's probably a different demographic reality where the new generation doesn't have the direct linkage with Germany of the 1940s that she had and other people
But
had.
they have that atavistic hatred, and you kind of even saw it in the 1990s when suddenly their loathing for the Serbs all came out, into the open. It had all been suppressed, and suddenly, whoom,
I just
before World War II, with this loathing for the Serbs, Serbian was Serbian.
And there's a loathing for the Russians too. I just wanted to clarify that in case people picked up on that and said, well, Ritter.
But Scott brings up a good point, because neoliberalism needs to loathe another. It has to loathe the other. And that justifies anything, okay? And it can be the Russians, it can be the Serbs, and they justify it in themselves as being virtuous. This is one of the most bizarre things, how they're all woke, but they're overtly racist. Okay, you've already said it. I mean, put the word Jew in there, and it has a totally different reaction. Okay, but they won't do that. But all of this is intentional. I mean, the European Union is fighting for its very survival, and the way they survive is to be anti-Russian. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it's going to end very, very badly, but that's the path they're going to take, because they don't take any responsibility for their actions, okay?
Well, they've never been held to account. I think this winter is going to be one of the first times that the European Union is going to be held to account as an organization. And I do think, even though NATO suffered, as you said, the far, far, far backyard defeat in Afghanistan, NATO is going to be held to account. And I think fractures are going to develop over the course of this winter. Look, there's a lot of wild cards out there. I'll give you one. What happens if Turkey decides that it's going to retake some Aegean islands from the Greeks? What happens? Now, the French have already said they're going to come on side of Greeks. So what happens when the Turks start sinking French ships? When they start bombing NATO bases, because they're really Greek bases in there? What happens when they start bombing Crete? And the Americans we got based on, are we going to go to war against Turkey? Because the second that happens, the second Turkey bombs Greece, NATO's finished, done. Say goodbye to it. It's going to unravel that quick. That's a real risk. I mean, Erdogan's telling the Greeks, remember Smyrna. My God, remember 200,000 people being ethnically cleansed. And you don't want that to happen again now, do you? I mean, this is not a joke. But again, we in the West tend to go, oh, no, that's just inconvenient Turkish talk. No, it's real. There's that. What happens when this gas thing, because I think what's going to happen this winter is there's going to be the haves and the have-nots. People that made wise decisions, like Hungary, and the people that made bad decisions, like Germany. And with that is going to be deep resentment. You already hear people talking about kicking Hungary out of the EU for things. What happens when you talk about Germany, and blurring the line about the EU? It was interesting. Poland has come back and said, we want reparations from Germany. And there's a lot of Germans that say, we want to erase a certain borderline, because I think we remember Silesia as ours. Yeah. You guys want to play that game? We can play that game.
And Wrocław still looks very German if you go there.
Well, it will be very German again if Poland's not careful. There's a reason why Poland has had its map redrawn many times, because the Polish make bad decisions. And they're making some very bad decisions today. Poland should not be taking the lead in confronting Russia.
I'm sorry, Scott, I just have to say this, but I mean, we've already made references to the 1930s. I don't know if you noticed, but I don't know what minister it was, but it was in the last news cycle. Did you know that Poland is the locomotive of progress and innovation in Europe today? And I would go back to Colonel Beck as foreign minister in Poland in late 1930s, and say, Poland is at the very center of the diplomatic world. I mean, I don't know, George, if I'm making too much of this, but I just thought this was just kind of bizarre, that we have this exaggerated sense of importance here, right before a cataclysm occurred.
And the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize. I can't remember what year, but it wasn't that long ago. So I think that that Nobel Peace Prize is about as deserved as Barack Obama's.
Barack Obama's.
Anyway, Scott, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Yeah. Thank you again so much for giving us your time. That's very generous of you. And all our conversations just go by so quickly, so we don't even realize how much time has gone. So thank you again, Scott. And look forward to talking to you again soon. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.